carry me back to old Virginia. Carry me back to old Virginia. There's where the cotton and the corn and taters grow.
What to do now? To be sure, Virginia had suffered for the last 17 years, but by 1624, the situation seemed to be improving, if ever so slightly. She had seen private enterprises pop up all along the James River. She had endured a punishing Indian attack and survived, while also beating the threat back. She had created her own local, representative government. But no one knew what to expect both in Virginia and in England after the Crown took over the colony. Would settlers escaping poverty, intolerance, and other difficulties see those very same issues follow them across the Atlantic? King James didn't trust Sandys and his followers, the same men who were largely responsible for setting up the early James River plantations. But King James soon passed from the scene. How would his son Charles treat the settlement and her leaders? It was almost as if Virginia might be starting all over. It didn't, but a new era certainly did dawn, and that era, Virginia as a royal colony, would unfold in parts that led up to Virginia's forcefully throwing off the royal yoke decades later. If one looks closely at the historical record, he might see the slightest inkling of the later independence conflict almost as soon as King James dissolved the Virginia Company in 1624. As we continue walking through Virginia's early history, we'll visit this theme often. The struggle for independence dominates Virginia's history and helped shape her into a powerhouse. But before she became a powerhouse in American history, Virginia would have to endure many more growing pains, the first of which were seen soon after she became a royal colony.
Whoa, sun is rising with all the sweetness it can bring. A new day is beginning, and all my fears have vanished.
James had ended the Virginia Company's rule over the colony in 1624, but he didn't live long enough to craft his new colony into the profit-making venture of his dreams. He did, however, keep a few men around, such as Thomas Smythe, to serve on his governing council, but no one knew exactly what they'd be doing. Further, the colonists, who by 1624 had well-tasted local representative self-government, were unsure about how to respond to the potentially new governing situation. They liked being able to govern themselves, and they loved having the Atlantic Ocean between their new homes and England. The distance between Virginia and England was a selling point for the thousands who endured the treacherous voyage across the Atlantic. But according to the 1625 census, only 1,232 survived, 952 men, 12 were Africans, and 80 women, 11 were Africans. By 1630, and countless more deaths, the census recorded about 3,000 souls. 10 years later, the total would increase to 8,000, and then 40,000, 2,000 of whom were Africans, on the eve of Bacon's Rebellion in the 1670s. Though Virginia wouldn't expand the way one might normally expect. Cities didn't dot the landscape. In fact, villages and townships were not on anyone's mind. Incoming settlers wanted their own vast landholdings free from outside meddling. To this point, the closest thing to a village, town, or a city that Virginia had was Jamestown or Henricus. But after 1622, both locations were either abandoned, like Henricus, or in severe decline, like Jamestown. Outside of those two settlements, Virginia was a few dozen plantations. Those plantations functioned cooperatively in that they planted crops, built buildings and fortifications, established their own unique communities, and encouraged colonists to eventually settle their own plantations once their indentures were complete. Virginia and Virginians, therefore, were not looking to create ever larger cities. Englishmen came to Virginia for abundant land free from tyrannical oversight, land upon which one could make incredible profits growing tobacco. The rate of incoming Virginia settlers steadily increased, and soon all were bit by the tobacco bug. Even a group of arriving Frenchmen in 1632, who were to introduce vine growing for wine production, left their experience behind to grow tobacco. This is where the government across the Atlantic stepped in. Not long after those Frenchmen immigrated to Virginia, the English government began stepping in to pass laws regulating tobacco production and requiring tradesmen to conduct business only in their particular trades. Many historians argue that this was a good step to take, in that tobacco farmers needed to be regulated, or the colony would starve to death. While I can see the wisdom in such a thought, I don't agree with the notion. For one, the law of supply and demand started to regulate new planters arriving in the colony. The price per pound of tobacco dropped from 18 shillings to 1 penny by 1625. Secondarily, supply and demand were broken in at least one key manner by the colonial leaders and governmental authorities alike, as they worked together to fix prices in a way that would arbitrarily benefit those within the royal sphere of influence. What eventually stemmed from these regulations was an insatiable land grab by men who had little to no means available to work their ever larger land grants. By the 1640s, settlers began looking for ever cheaper labor, and they found it, very slowly at first, but in the slave trade. More on that in future episodes, however. Finally, as far as corn is concerned, Governor Wyatt enacted a disastrous decree on September 4, 1623, that must also be considered in light of regulation. The colony still had a central storehouse that many people, especially the newly arriving colonists, dipped into to feed themselves. This seemed to allow settlers to rely upon the colony for food while they set about the tobacco business. But too many colonists arrived, which taxed the central system beyond capacity. So the newly arriving settlers did the unthinkable. They turned to trading with the Indians, the very same Indians that men like Francis Wyatt were warring against. Wyatt couldn't allow such trade to happen, so he declared it illegal, because the English and the Powhatans were at war with one another. Subsequently, the price for corn skyrocketed overnight. What was once supposed to be a colony-supplied staple became an expensive burden as the price per pound shot up to about $10 a pound in today's currency. Englishmen seeking to trade for corn had to do so on the black market, and the Indians were more than willing to trade corn for weapons and tools that they had so craved. Thus, Wyatt added more insult to injury in issuing his September decree. Governor Wyatt, acting in the Crown's name, also sought to curtail expansion away from Virginia's main power centers along the James. Prior to 1624, most of the focused attention centered upon the James River, as we have already seen in the early James River plantations. Many of those plantations ceased to exist, however, for a time or altogether. But after 1624, new settlers helped to revitalize those plantations all along the James. Soon, however, some of those settlers wanted more. Newly arriving Englishmen grabbed land with great celerity. Men like Adam Thorogood, Daniel Tanner, Thomas Willoughby, and others had tasted some of what Virginia had to offer, and by the 1620s started to search for new claims. What's novel about these men is that they started looking out from the original James River sphere and began patenting claims in what today is collectively called Hampton Roads, as well as other locations northward along the York River. But most of those new claims lay untouched at least until the 1620s and early 1630s for one reason or another. One of those reasons was that Governor Wyatt attempted to keep those settlers back by building a wall from Martin's Hundred to Kiskiak. It was a sort of pitiful Hadrian's Wall recreation that on the face of it was meant to keep the Indians away. Sure, it did serve that purpose, but it was really meant to keep the colonists in, while they focused upon developing the colony. Once men like Wyatt deemed that development successful, only then could colonists settle new lands to the west. Regardless, even in this fledgling governmental setup, Wyatt couldn't get the support he needed to build his wall before he left office in 1626.
Deep inside, change is coming.
After Wyatt left, George Yardley came back into power and worked to keep much of Wyatt's plans moving forward. There did happen to be a real fear of attack from either the Indians or other marauding European countries, so creating defenses was a high priority for the government. Yardley organized regional watches under Captain William Tucker, who was then stationed at Port Comfort, where a fort was rebuilt to replace the earlier built fortifications. Next, Yardley worked to control the northern expansion. He did so by first proclaiming that any settler who wanted to settle away from the current location had to receive permission to do so by both the governor and the council. Further, a settler who just wanted to leave his home for a short period required at least getting permission from his plantation commander. The final step in Yardley's plans was launching an August 1627 attack against the Indians at Kiskiak, which was to wipe out their settlement as well as all other surrounding native locations. The attack was semi-successful in that it defeated the natives, but it didn't wipe them out as Yardley had wanted. Before he could relaunch his dastardly plan, however, Yardley died in November 1627 and was replaced by Captain Francis West, another of Thomas West, Lord Delaware's brothers. The colonists, however, seemed somewhat disinterested in what the Crown was trying to do with the colony. It's not that they didn't care about potential threats. They did. But early in the 1620s, many settlers didn't plan to stay long. They wanted to make their money in tobacco and leave. However, that all started to change, and with it, so too would Virginia. Prior to 1624, many of the settlements were carved out in a ragtag manner that screamed impermanence. It's why we don't have any structures from that period still standing today. But as settlers started to increase their wealth, they started to build more permanent dwellings. Wood gave way to stone or brick, and some of the earliest Virginia homes began to dot the landscape. This is where the Thorogood, Willoughby, and Tanners come in. They established plantations south of Jamestown in today's Norfolk and Virginia Beach. I won't dive into too much detail at this point, but suffice it to say for now, all three men did leave their marks, especially if you take a look at their names being used to name the regions and places like the Thorogood section of Virginia Beach or Willoughby Spit and Tanner's Creek in Norfolk. These early settlers were not the only ones to venture southward, in keeping with Wyatt and Yardley's desire to settle below the Kiskiak-Martin Hundred line. They were just the most successful at that time, and their homes built on massive plots of land proved it. But that prosperity was built upon tobacco, something King James hated. King Charles may not have despised the weed as much as his father famously did, but he didn't like Virginia's reliance upon it for wealth creation. So in 1627, Charles instructed his lieutenants to curtail tobacco production by not allowing the head of a family to grow more than 200 pounds of tobacco a year. Further, no servant was allowed to grow 125 pounds for his master either. Finally, all Virginia tobacco was to be consigned to the king through his representatives. It was his tobacco and could only be sent to England. Yet Charles thought he had sweetened the deal when he expelled Spanish tobacco from England, thus ensuring that the Virginians had a monopoly in the mother country. But he was mistaken, as can be seen in how the Assembly answered the king in March 1628. Now, Charles didn't directly state his commands. He attempted to work through the governor and General Assembly, and that he gave his commands and expected the local authorities to figure out how to enact them. The Assembly opened by thanking the king for ridding Spanish competition from the market. But since Charles was now taking all of Virginia's tobacco, he should set a price at 3 shillings 6 pence per pound delivered to Virginia, and 4 shillings delivered in London for 500,000 pounds a year produced. If Charles refused, the colonists wished the freedom to sell their tobacco to other markets such as the Netherlands, or even in Ireland and Turkey. The Assembly then answered the issue of growing limits by saying that such a cap would not be sufficient. They simply didn't want to endure sinking so much of their wealth into projects that Charles desired, especially given that those projects promised very little return, if any at all. No, tobacco was the way to become rich quick, so they stuck to growing the weed. The Assembly hired former Governor Francis Wyatt to represent their response to Charles' demands, and somewhat succeeded in their reply. The only change was that the price demand was lessened by 6 pence per pound. Representative government proved workably successful, and just like the more permanent dwellings being created by increasingly wealthy settlers, representative government was in Virginia to stay. The concerns that the post-Virginia Company settlers may have had in 1624 were therefore certainly vanishing by 1627. In place of those fears, an interesting reality began taking shape. Newly arriving English settlers began seeing themselves as different from their countrymen. They began seeing themselves as Virginians. From the beginning, Virginians began possessing a fierce independence. That independence would be seen in generations to come, in famous instances such as the American War for Independence, as well as the less well-known American Westward Movement, in which more land was sought after by Virginians. But for now, a settled, permanent Virginia started to emerge from the death-plagued Virginia Company Foundation. Thank you for tuning into this edition of the Virginia History Podcast. Please help this colony to keep growing. Consider supporting the venture on Patreon. Or perhaps you'd like some merchandise. Or maybe a one-time donation fits your budget better. Links for all of these possibilities can be found on our podcast website under the Support tab at vahistorypodcast.com. Other ways to help out are liking us on social media. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/VAHispod, or following me on Instagram at RKVanNess. I've also begun uploading podcast episodes to YouTube. They can all be found by finding my channel at Robert Van Ness. If you haven't done so already, please leave a review on iTunes. Doing so helps increase visibility in the Apple Podcast Network, the largest podcast outlet on the internet. And finally, tune in again next time as we continue to walk through Virginia's history.
Tudo bate despedido do Zé,